Hello and welcome to my presentation about the steamship Great Eastern. The Great Eastern was a steamship built during the 1800s. Its mission was to build a ship that could sail from Britain to Asia without need for refueling. It was the biggest ship at the time ever built. And broke a lot of records for a lot of things as you will see later. The man or men behind this great project was Mr. Burnell, who was a famous engineer during the Industrial Revolution and is known as the greatest engineer in human history by some. He had done a lot of great work. He was one of the main architects behind the British railroad system. He had done a lot of work in bridge engineering, and he built the first ship to sail from Britain to America with a screw. The second man behind this is John Scott Russell, a revolutionary naval architect who had changed the way we built ships. And he also did some work in physics by studying the Doppler effect and describing how waves behave. Except for these two men, and there was also the Eastern Navigational Company who financed this large project, and of course there was 12,000 workers who actually built the thing. And among these workers were of course children and adults, because it was the Industrial Revolution, so no one cared. This is the specs for the ship. As you will see, it has 4,000. It has a capacity for 4,000 passengers, and it made a record in both length and tonnage that was first surpassed nearly 40 years later. But as you can also see, it didn't live long. It was scrapped already 30 years after its initial launch, which is of course quite a shame. As you can see, the propulsion is two paddle wheels that were driven by two steam engines each, and one screw that was driven by a separate steam engine. And except for these two steam-powered propulsion systems, it also had 5 sails. These steam engines together produced 8,000 horsepower or 6 megawatt. The whole ship was made out of iron, and was one of the first to use a two-hull system where you have an outer skin and then a space between, and then another skin. And so if the outer skin is damaged by a reef, and then the inner skin will hold so people don't drown and the ship don't sink. This is also a system that is known from the Titanic, that of course had 7 skins as far as I remember. Then there's the problem, because there's a very good reason why we haven't heard a lot of the Great Eastern and why it only lasted 30 years. Yes, it had problems from the very start of its creation to the very end. And the first problem that it faced was the funding. It was such a massive project that it was hard to get funding from anybody. But in the end, Mr. Burnell managed to find the Eastern Navigational Company who agreed to fund his ship, which in the end caused the company to go bankrupt. Then, when they actually started working on the ship at Russell's shipyard, they had a great setback when a fire started in the shipyard and destroyed all their schematics and models, which of course set the work back quite a lot. But the next crisis to hit the construction project was when about 1,000 tons of iron went missing. Or, of course, not all at once, but when they calculated how much iron had been delivered and how much had been used for the ship, they simply missed. There was simply 12,000 tons of iron missing. It is thought but never proven that Russell sold this iron to his creditors. Let's see. Russell, well, partly because of the fire and because of other circumstances, had borrowed a lot of money and thus had a hell of a lot of creditors. As this eventually led to him going bankrupt and his shipyard being closed down for 1 week. However, the navigational company and Burnell managed to find a solution with Russell's creditor that allowed them to continue to work with Great Eastern. Then there was a great problem with the launch of the ship, both in the human department and the technical department. Burnell and Russell had a lot of arguments about how to actually launch the ship. Burnell wanted to do it differently from all other ships that had ever been launched because he was a very innovative man, and he eventually won out, partly because Russell didn't really have anything to say after his bankruptcy. The East Navigation Company also made Burnell somewhat tired when they sold 3,000 tickets for spectators to come and see the launch of this great ship, even though Burnell would have wanted to simply have the men who were going to launch the ship and no one else, because it was a very hard process, as that needed a lot of steam engines to actually tow this ship into the water of the Thames. And indeed, it also went terribly wrong, as one of the steam engines malfunctioned and one of the great chains that was being used to pull the ship it snapped back, killing one of the workers and others being injured by the steam from the engine. And it would take months to actually get the ship into the water, but it eventually happened the 31st of January 1858 and 85. No matter. As you can see here, sorry about the dates. Then there was another problem when the ship was going to have its maiden voyage. But the first thing to go wrong was that Burnell had a stroke. He had been sick for a long time during the construction, and when the ship was just about to set its figurative sails, he had a stroke and had to stay home. And that was perhaps pretty good, because when the ship actually started sailing, it didn't get far before one of the steam engines exploded, killing five workers and ending the maiden voyage. That's when Burnell got this news. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died shortly thereafter. When the ship was finally scrapped, it is said that the corpse of 2 children were found between the two skins of the hull. And some say that this is the reason for the many problems with the ship, that the 2 corpses had caused a curse to be levied upon the ship. This is, however, only a rumor, and other sources say that there was no such corpses, and indeed, if someone were trapped between the two layers, they would have ample opportunity to get out. But we have to talk about the successes and failures of this great ship. Here you can see a model, just to illustrate how large and incredible this ship was. One success of the ship was the Great Eastern Rock Incident, where the Great Eastern hit a rock while sailing into a port, which caused a gash 60 times the size of the gash that sank the Titanic. And the great thing about this horrible incident is that the crew, who barely even noticed, they just knew that they hit a rock, but they didn't know exactly how big the problem was before they got into port, and the passengers never noticed, which is pretty great. The other great thing that the Great Eastern achieved was as a cable-laying vessel by the end of its lifetime. It was used to lay the first transatlantic cable from Britain to America. That was of course used for telegraph. For this task, the ship's enormous size was a great asset, as it could maneuver and wasn't as affected by the weather as other ships would have been. But of course, as far as I'm concerned, it failed on most levels, except of course as a great feat of engineering. But it was a financial failure. The Eastern Navigation Company went bankrupt trying to get some money out of it. Later, a new company called the Great Eastern Company, it tried to make some money off of it, and it never worked. It even served as a music hall and sailing advertisement, but no one could ever make any money off of it. At least not at any significant amount. And of course, it never actually reached the East, which was quite a shame. Being the Great Eastern, there simply wasn't any demand for a steamship with this capacity. It was simply too enormous for anyone to take the ship all the way to the east. And of course, that is the great tragedy of the Great Eastern. It was such a feat of engineering, and yet no one actually ever used it. And then, of course, any questions? But seeing as how I'm talking to myself, that would be kind of weird.